What Jesus said is recorded in Matthew 24, verse 6, as part of the last days, there'd be wars and reports of wars. And then in verse 7, he said, nation will rise against nation. So we've seen that fulfilled in our lifetime. In a war, you have two sides. They're opposing sides, aren't they? And there's a different kind of war, though, that's in our text today and that those commenting discussed. And we'd like to read about it in Romans chapter 7, verses 22 and 23. You'll notice these verses are also in the Watchtower summary. I'd like to read them because listen to how Paul described this war. Okay, it's a different kind of war. 7:22. I really delight in the law of God according to the man I am within. But I see in my body another law warring against the law of my mind and leading me captive to sin's law that is in my body. So there's a war going on, is what he's describing. Now go over to Galatians chapter 5, if you would, and let's look at Paul describing the same war, but in a different way. It's Galatians 5 and verse 17. 5:17. He says, for the flesh is against the spirit in its desire, and the spirit against the flesh. These are opposed to each other, so that you do not do the very things you want to do. So there's the two opposing sides. One is the flesh. What's the flesh? Well, that's the imperfect individual that we are. We get it from Adam. His sinful course has been passed down through your parents, my parents, and to us. We are all imperfect. And so the flesh, this imperfect state that we find ourselves in. Now, what's the other side? Well, if you notice in verse 7, it says the flesh is against the spirit in its desire. The Spirit, God's Holy Spirit, is really a force for righteousness. The sinful flesh continually wars against the positive influence of God's Holy Spirit upon the spiritual man. And it's constantly putting pressure upon us to give in to the works or the desires of the flesh. And what are they? Well, he continues on in Galatians 5, verse 19. He says, now the works of the flesh are plainly seen. Now, it's true, isn't it? I mean, a spiritual man, woman, we understand the works of the flesh. And he describes some of them: sexual immorality, uncleanness, brazen conduct, idolatry, spiritism, hostility, strife, jealousy, fits of anger, dissensions, division, sects, envy, drunkenness, wild parties, and things like these. And so, yes, it's a constant battle, these fleshly desires that go along with this human imperfection. So the question is, how do we win the war? The flesh and the spirit. Well, one important aspect is strategy. You're not going to win a war if you don't strategize. We'll take an example of a strategy in a literal war. If you go to Judges chapter 6, this is the Midianites fighting against the Israelites. And what was the strategy of the Midianites? Here's one of them in verse 4. It was to destroy the food, get rid of their animals. In verse 4, it says they would camp against them and ruin the produce of the land all the way to Gaza. And they left nothing for Israel to eat, and no sheep or bull or donkey. So that was their strategy, to starve the Israelites out. Now, interestingly, what was the strategy of the Israelites? Well, notice verse 2. The hand of Midian dominated over Israel. Because of Midian, the Israelites made hiding places for themselves in the mountains, in the caves, and the places difficult to approach. They went and hid. What kind of strategy is that? And Jehovah said, no, you're not going to win the war that way. And then, of course, we know he said he gave the correct strategy. He told them what to use with the Gideon's men. And that's exactly what took place. 300 men, right? The large jars and horns. And we know the result. It was a crushing defeat for the Midianites. So the question is this: who's going to win the war that we are fighting? The uniqueness about this war is both sides are within ourselves. How do you strategize against yourself? Well, as spiritual people, we have to be sure that the fleshly person that we are, I am, is kept in check. For example, perhaps a fleshly person is attracted to someone of the opposite sex. Oh, look over there. There she is. Let's see if I can get a little bit closer. And what's happening? Well, the fleshly man is strategizing to undermine the spiritual person. Where's the spiritual person at that time? Is he hiding someplace like the Israelites did with the Midian? Reminds us of David. Remember from the rooftop, he was looking at his neighbor Bathsheba, and she was bathing. She was a beautiful woman. That look ended in committing adultery. How should the spiritual person react under those circumstances? Well, he has to go on the offensive. He can't go put his head in the sand, can't go in a cave and hide. See, a strategy has to be carefully thought out in advance. Now, we have an occasion in the Bible that talks about the spiritual man Joseph, and you remember he was tempted by Potiphar's wife, but he immediately overpowered the fleshly man and said, how could I commit this great badness and actually sin against God? So just like Joseph then, we need to keep the spiritual person that we are fortified and stay alert to the fleshly desires of the fleshly person that we are. Because the fleshly person is always scheming against the spiritual man. Now, back to Romans, if you would, the 6th chapter in verses 12 and 13, because Paul further talks about this matter and the weapons needed. 6 verse 12, Romans. Therefore, do not let sin continue to rule as king in your mortal bodies, so that you should obey their desires. Neither go on presenting your bodies to sin as weapons of unrighteousness, but present yourselves to God as those alive from the dead, also your bodies to God as weapons of righteousness. So in this battle, what we have to do is to identify the sinful desires that influences us. We have to go back to those works of the flesh and identify where is the leaning of the fleshly man or woman that I am. And then through prayer and study, be armed with the weapons of righteousness to counteract the enemy that's dwelling within ourselves. Now, in connection with the literal wars, well, we long for the fulfillment of Isaiah 2:4. Nation will not lift up sword against nation, neither will they learn war anymore. And when it comes to the internal war that each of us is fighting, well, we long for the time when we'll all be perfect. And we can say regarding the internal battle that we've had for many, many years, we have won the war.